Greetings and welcome. The year 2023 marks the 80th year of the Bengal Famine of 1943. The historiography of India on the eve of independence has focused primarily on the nationalist struggle, on the negotiations for transfer of power, and the outbreak of communal riots that eventually led to independence and partition of India. The Bengal famine of 1943 has been largely overlooked and sidetracked from the main course of events that led to independence of India. That the Bengal famine was integral and interconnected with other historical events like World War II and the Great Calcutta Riots of 1946 in shaping political, economic, and social context of pre-partition Bengal has not been adequately addressed. Gitika Trust, in remembering this historic event in its 80th year, attempts to revisit the Bengal famine. I take great pleasure in welcoming and introducing Dr. Colin Alexander to our session today. Colin is a senior lecturer in political communications, Nottingham, Trent University, UK, and was a research fellow at the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Taiwan Normal University during the year 2013. He has several academic publications. To name the most recent ones, he's the author of Administering, Colonialism and War, The Political Life of Sir Andrew Clow of the Indian Civil Service, Oxford University Press, 2019, and has also co-edited The Frontiers of Public Diplomacy, Hegemony, Morality and Power in International Sphere, New York, Routledge, 2021. He has contributed immensely and has a long list of book chapters and papers in several academic journals. Colin has contributed papers and made presentations in conferences, workshops, and invited lectures across the globe. Currently, is engaged in several academic research projects and anticipates major publications, such as Understanding Taiwan and its International Isolation. He's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a committed public academic. He has appeared on the BBC television news, World Service News, and Victoria Derbyshire Current Affairs program to reach out beyond academia. Over to Colin Alexander. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you to Sujata for that very kind introduction, and thank you also to the Gitika Trust for first of all, actually, for the work that you do, important work that is done, which makes a valuable contribution to, even in a small way, alleviating some of the social, economic, political issues that we see in your part of the world. I'll start by saying that I wouldn't consider myself to have expertise in the Bengal famine as a specific event. There are other people who have studied it in much more detail, who are academic experts on famine itself. That's not me. I work in the realm of political communications, and particularly in propaganda studies. I'm also interested in North-South relations, global North-South relations, but particularly the colonial heritage of the UK. So when I began to study the Bengal famine about 10 years ago now, I was doing so as a part of a wider project, which, as Sujata mentioned, was part of my book, Administering, Colonialism and War. And again, as Sujata noted in her introduction to me, the Bengal famine occurred in the middle of the Second World War, and therefore that led me to, I guess, to think more about it in different ways. I'm also interested in aspects of charity, in foreign aid, development assistance, from a critical perspective, and so I felt quite well placed to tackle the Bengal famine, and it is chapter 5 of my book. Now, why did I write a book on somebody called Sir Andrew Clow, who was the governor of Assam between 1942 and 1947, and was the minister in charge of communications and thus propaganda from the mid 1930s through to 1942, before he became the governor of Assam? Well, I am directly related to Sir Andrew Clow. He is my great uncle. So he is my mother's father's uncle. And there are people alive in my family, very old now. My grandmother, who is almost 96, and she has a lot of memories of Sir Andrew. Sir Andrew died in 1957 after a long career in the Indian civil service. And I, as a researcher, became interested in doing a little bit of family history, as well as doing a political biography of him. And as it emerged, clearly Sir Andrew was not in Bengal, or at least it wasn't his governorship of that province. However, as the neighbouring province of Assam, Sir Andrew is requested to provide lots of assistance, and he also has the spillover of the refugee crises which emerges during that time as well. So if you go through the internal communiques going between the various British officials at the time, particularly as we get into mid-1943 onwards, as the famine really takes hold, you see all lines of communication going back and forth. And it's really the other than the war itself, it's the most important political issue of the day. Now, when Sujata first contacted me, you quoted a part of my book to me, which was the quote that I have listed here. Those who suffered the famine were those who could not afford food as a result of the boom economy, and who the British did not prioritize as, inverted commas, useful to save. And I believe, Sujata, you said that this had been quite impactful upon your thinking about the event. And so I thought what I would do for half an hour or so today is just try and expand a bit on that, and to explain what was occurring during that period, and why I'm talking about human beings and their usefulness, if you like. My argument would be that the Bengal famine is very much a nadir of colonialism. It really is probably the low point of colonialism, in that we see lines or divisions drawn between who has rights and who does not. So for all that the British government of India, through the early part of the 20th century, had made some reforms. So the India Act of 1911 had given more rights to Indians. Again, the various India Acts of the 1920s had given more rights to Indians. But what we still see is a clear division between who is a citizen of empire and who is a subaltern of empire. If you look at the food policies of the Second World War in Britain. We have rationing, we have not much, but a bare minimum subsistence, which is provided to people. That doesn't happen in India. And it doesn't happen, I would argue, because certain groups in society were not seen as useful or not useful enough and didn't have the same rights. This is the problem, really, a much broader problem between democracy and authoritarianism. Those who are in authoritarian regimes are not protected by the same civil rights as those in democratic regimes. So while democracies and authoritarian regimes are usually quite similar in their, for example, environmental records, trees and animals don't vote, so democracy doesn't care that much about them in comparison. So China's as good at environmentalism as anywhere else. But when it comes to human beings, genocides, famines don't tend to happen in democracies, usually because there is some form of structure in place to prevent that from occurring, even if, as I say, hardships are still very much possible. I want to draw your attention to this photograph, and I'm going to talk about the famine shortly, but I wanted to just set a bit of background against this. I'm not going to pretend. I'm a great fan of this photograph. A fan in the most critical way. This is Sir Andrew Clow, my great-great-uncle, standing in the centre with his hands in his pockets. And you see him with his fellow ICS serviceman and great friend, Roderick MacLeod, with the rifle. And they had been crocodile hunting on the Indus River on Christmas Day, 1917. And both are quite young men. And I think so many of the lines of colonialism are drawn here. First of all, you see the two men dressed very differently from the Indian people next to them. The Indian people stand behind them as well. You also have the taming of nature, the shooting of an animal for sport, which I think is a pastime of those who are conquerors in many ways. And the final aspect of it is that it is a mugger crocodile itself. And the word mugger has moved from India into the British and into the English language. So in my country, we talk about muggings as essentially a street crime, where people are usually violently accosted and have their phone or their wallet, purse taken from them. As Britain saw immigration from the former colonies in the 1950s, 1960s, we also see the emergence of the word, the mugging word, emerging as well. And it was a word which was particularly meant to describe the actions of brown or black men and a sense of them trying to instill fear. So the mugger crocodile was famed for snatching usually young people off the banks of the river, dragging them down. And there was a sort of sense that this type of thing was synonymous now with street crime. So we see the legacy of colonialism and the sense of prejudice moving into our society as well. So as I said, I really like this photograph. It epitomizes all these different things, and it makes quite an important point when it comes to the famine around just general prejudice, everyday prejudice, which underpinned empire. So the question is, was the Bengal famine racist? I think the answer is yes and no. Certainly, if you look at the communiques among the ICS Indian civil service, and you also look at the diaries of servicemen, you will see that quite classic colonial, inverted commas, lazy native narrative. So the Indians would do better if they were just a bit more enthusiastic and they just worked a bit harder. And to some extent, we still see this narrative today across the world when it comes to why the poor are in any condition of poverty. And I'm sure that the Gitika Trust's work, you encounter this idea of you just need to work harder, work smarter, rather than the system. The system is fundamentally against you in some way. So on the one hand, we do have a lazy native narrative, which confounds the potential for relief to occur. The second question is, was it because they were Bengali? Now, some works on the famine have indicated that, for example, Winston Churchill had a particular dislike for Bengalis, and that he thought that Bengal was a sort of hotbed of anti-British sentiment, which it, to some extent it was, but then that's not to say that that wasn't a legitimate concern on the part of the Bengali people as to their maltreatment by the colonial hands. But it wasn't necessarily about being Bengali in particular, because unfortunately the British policies in all parts of the empire led to food shortages and food insecurity for some people at different times. You can go to somewhere like Ireland, just across the water from me, where the British were a colonial regime, and during the 1850s, we see the what is perhaps inappropriately called the potato famine. Wasn't a potato famine occurring, and quite similar actions and non-actions occurring by the British against people who were as white as they were. The final thing to say was that there's no evidence of the British having a proactive extermination policy. So we are not talking about genocide here. We're not talking about what, for example, Joseph Stalin did in the Soviet Union, where he deliberately starved Ukrainians in an incident called the Holodomor in the 1930s. This was, I would suggest, a circumstance, a happening which emerged through prioritization of other things, but also incompetence as well. And I'll talk to you about the various factors that I have. But I thought what I would do is just provide you with a short reading from the book at this stage, and then we can move on to talk about other matters soon. So this is from page 191. There is no evidence that the British attempted to exterminate Bengalis through starvation, as the Soviet Union attempted to do to Ukrainians during the 1930s. And it certainly was not their desire to instigate mass migration. Indeed, the British policy during most of 1942 and 1943 was for there to be no further mass movement of people following the Burma refugee crisis of early 1942. Moreover, Bengali labour was crucial to the war effort, and successful Bengali agriculture was important as the population of the wider region had increased significantly. Mukherjee's 2010 argument that Winston Churchill despised Bengal as it was a hotbed of anti-British sentiment is most likely true, as this has been confirmed by several sources. However, the argument that he purposefully starved or punished the province, or that he had the ability to orchestrate such a policy, is less clear. Churchill's priority, indeed, he believed it to be his destiny, was to win the war for the British, and the mass starvation of rural Bengalis, whom he perceived as having very little to offer a British victory, was a consequence of a wider strategic goal. Okay. So if you want to look at colonial theory, then what we have here is a scenario where at any one time around 1100, maybe up to 1200, ICS officials essentially run India at any one time. Now, yes, there are some military backing for this, but other than the Indian Mutiny of the 1850s, colonialism relies upon a communication of power. And this is something which, if you look at the works of Albert Memmi, he talks about this relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and about how power must ultimately be communicated. Because if the Indians had wanted to overwhelm the British, they could have very, very easily done this. But of course, like any society, why are we consenting to be ruled? In any way is a matter of identities through both word and deed, which implicitly and explicitly mold the colonizer and the colonized into their roles as slave and master. The use of available mass communications technologies forms a key part of this process, or has the potential to undermine the premise by which colonialism operates, if in the hands of the colonial other. So what you see in India, and particularly with, say, my work around Andrew Clow, was that they were very keen that emerging technologies, particularly radio broadcasts from the 1930s, were kept in the hands of those who could be trusted. And so we have a select number of Indian voices in the various languages of India being selected to broadcast, but not saying anything which was deemed further than that was acceptable but by the British. However, in India, there is no sense at this time of public service broadcasting, where one of the remits of public service broadcasting, the BBC, for example, in this country, is for it to provide accurate, timely information when crises emerge. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example. You don't have this in India during the 1930s. You certainly have the radio network available, but it's not in the hands of those who are inclined to provide a public service, and who could therefore have said, there are supplies here, there are no supplies there, and been able to maneuver populations in a way which would have been most helpful to their survival. But so we don't have that. I think it's just important to note it. I also think that an important backstep to the famine is to understand the ICS servicemen who were in charge of relief of the famine, or indeed in charge of healthcare, social relations, etc., during this time. And when you look at somebody like Andrew Clow, and he's not untypical of other members of the ICS, they live apart from Indians. So I really like this quote, which is taken just before the famine. This is from his diary, Andrew Clow's diary. He says, "In the afternoon, I came to Government House." He's in Bombay at this point, or Mumbai at this point. He says, "In the afternoon, I came to Government House, delectable spot where company helped to cheer me, and its loveliness tempts one to forget the degradation of the Bombay slums." What he's saying here is that he's trying to shut out the suffering of the Indian other, and rather than confronting it. But what's interesting about Sir Andrew Clow is if you go to his diary entries when he first arrives in India in the 1910s, he's fascinated by Indian culture. He's very much entwined with it. He studies it. He's quite anthropological in what he's doing. But by 30 years of service or so later, 25 years of service later, he's very much distanced himself from it. And so what you have is colonial administrators not seeing India for what it is and making decisions in a bubble as to what the priority ought to be. In many ways, they are closer to London in their heads than they are to the people who are several hundred meters away from them down the street. And I think that's an added issue here in terms of the, perhaps not the geographical distance. I'm going to talk about the famine more specifically now. So one of the things I wanted to do as my research was to ultimately bring about a pretty solid list of factors as to why this famine happened. And that hadn't been done before. So people had talked about different things to do with the Bengal famine. And there have been various books written about it from different angles. Even, the works about Mother Teresa, for example, had discussed this in one form or another. The first thing to say is that all famines are political. Even a famine that is the result or occurs in the aftermath of a natural disaster of some kind, the ability of one to survive a famine is dependent upon a variety of social, economic, and political factors, and also the willingness of others to provide them with food. We see this, for example, in the recent earthquake in Turkey and in Syria, where Syria has somewhat been forgotten, and we may well have significant hardships that are going to occur after that. So, and I think in the political structures of colonialism, I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say, that there certainly was enough food. In this instance, in Bengal, there was enough food for everybody to eat. The problem then is, why do people not have access to that food? The other thing to say is that people don't die from famine. If you have a death certificate, they don't write famine on it. Usually, and actually people don't usually die from starvation in famine. It's usually cholera, dysentery, the body's not having a good enough immune system. And so diseases that are usually survivable or frequently survivable, like for example, malaria, the body is ill-equipped to deal with that. So it's very rare that people actually die of starvation in the famine. It's usually something else which gets them first. So my research into this, reading a lot of texts, also looking at the political communiques of the ICS servicemen at the time, and also reading the English language newspapers at the time as well to cover this, I drew up a list of factors as to why this famine happened, and I'll go through them now with you. First thing is, as I mentioned previously, there were population increases, very quick population, very sharp population increases in Bengal. First of all, as a result of refugees coming from Burma, where the British had relinquished their colonial control as the Japanese had invaded. But we also have the rising numbers of troops in the area as well, particularly British, particularly American, and those from other parts of the British Empire. All these people require feeding, and so we have a squeeze on food pressures. We also have people coming from Assam down, who had because there are sort of fighting in the tribal regions to the east of Bengal and to the east of Assam, and these people are leaving that area and they're coming into the big cities as well. And the final one is people, Bengalis, who live in other parts of the empire, other parts of India and other parts of the empire, returning home as the conflict, trying to get home as the conflict emerges. So we have certainly a large influx of people, which does create a supply pressure. The third thing, though, is that food which they do have is then prioritized for the war effort and its associated industries. Those who are deemed, this is why I say those who are deemed useful. So the British determined that the war is the most important thing, and those who are involved in the war effort get first choice. This means that Bengal's rural communities and those deemed not as useful. So this is predominantly a rural famine which happens. Now the cities become submerged with refugees and famished people, but those people have moved from the countryside and they've come into the cities. The fourth thing, I think, this is probably the most controversial area that we see, is the British policy of denial, which happens. Now, the British feared a Japanese naval attack in the Bay of Bengal. And so they did a few things. First of all, they lifted the railway lines and other transport mechanisms around the area so that they could not be used by the Japanese when they landed. And they also removed boats. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you know the geography of the Ganges Delta, but for people who are watching this who don't, there is a great reliance upon boats in this part of the world. Lots of small inland waterways, and a lot of trade happens on those boats, particularly food trades that go on. And so removing people's boats ultimately stranded them in different parts of the country. And particularly as the rainy season emerged, this led to significant problems with people being ultimately left to die where they were, because only very small boats were allowed. Only boats that would take maybe 4 or 5 people were permitted to stay. Anything larger than that, which would carry, hundreds of people across waterways, they were all removed. The other thing is that there was not a centralized food policy for India. So each province had control over its foodstuffs and could barter and trade with another province. India did have some central food stores, but nothing like what was required for this. And what we then have is different provinces refusing to trade with another province. And I would suggest partly because they saw what was happening in Bengal and didn't want that to happen to them as well. So in times of hardship, we see wonderful acts of generosity, but enormous acts of self-interest happening as well, great selfishness occurring. So people just essentially say, well, we're just going to actually seeing the famine induced a hoarding mentality even more into people, particularly in provinces in Bengal's periphery. The other aspect is price rises. Now, rice, I'm not going to sort of take you through all the statistics, but you see mounds of rice, the price skyrocketing 4, 5, 6 times what it was even a few months before. Now, a lot of people saw the price rise, and particularly subsistence farmers, for example, and thought, now is a good time to sell my rice, and sold it onto the market, only to realize that the price would jump another 3 or 4 times, another 300 or 400% from that. So what we have is a hoarding mentality where people are thinking, oh, I'm going to keep hold of this and try and sell it at a higher price. See what the market does, for example. But on the other hand, we have people who are keen to sell and then are not ultimately do themselves a disservice because of the inflation economy. We should also note that Bengal, particularly the commercial farmers, continue to export food to other parts of India and beyond during 1942 and into 1943. We see similar things in, for example, I mentioned the potato famine in Ireland in the 1850s. We see very, very similar things. The big commercial farms were still exporting meats and grains out of Ireland while the people around them were starving. The state of emergency, which would have allowed Bengal access to India's central stores, was not declared quickly enough. Indeed, if you look at the communiques of Sir Andrew Clow even into 1943, he is still not prepared to. He still doesn't think that there's a state of emergency. He's right in some ways. He says that Bengal has all the rice that he says, Bengal has all the rice that it needs. And he's right, it does, but it's being hoarded and people are not trading it, which is kind of the problem here. So his argument was that if you simply get rice from try and buy rice from other parts of India, well, that doesn't really solve the situation. So I do understand partly what Andrew Clow is saying on an economics basis, but ultimately the importance here is that we then flood the market with rice and allow people to, or indeed engage in price setting measures, which is what the government eventually does. Bengal is also an importer of food. Burma's Irrawaddy Delta is one of the what we call the larders of the world. And with the Japanese attack and conquest of that part of the world, we see trade with neighboring Burma drying up. The contract for the wartime contract for rice shipments, in amongst other things as well, was given to Steele Brothers. There's an element, again, I mentioned the recent pandemic before, but there's quite a similar element that happens here, where a company which didn't have much experience in the logistics of food, the shipments of food, was given the contract to move food. And what you see is shipments of rice and other foodstuffs turning up in Bengal and in other parts of India, spoiled. It's gone off. For example, the water has got into the shipment, and it's sort of rotted. So there's an incompetence from Steele Brothers, an ignorance from Steele Brothers, and also they were not. They as an organisation were not cut out to do this, even though they won the contract to do it. So there may well have been some sort of corruption involved in it. In October, November 1942, there was a tropical cyclone, which has significant damage along the Bay of Bengal. But dare I say, that's not an unusual thing to happen. But it certainly did exacerbate the problems. I should say at this point that to understand a famine, you don't necessarily look at 1943 and what happens as the famine starts. The famine is caused by the events of the year before. You have to look to 1942 to understand why 1943 happened. The Bengal police force in 1942, as the British policy was to round up and anti-colonial dissidents. So as a war situation emerged following Japanese attack in December 1941, you see in early 1942, the Bengal police force, as I say, trying to round up and incarcerate, in some cases, Indian nationalists. Some of their tactics involved burning houses and also burning large food depots as well. So some of that is part of it. So, and as I say, but one of the things that we see in it, this is, it kind of goes back to sort of basic human nature. It's just an unwillingness to share, whether that be in economic terms or in just in sort of cultural terms. The regular process of barter and community breaks down in a famine situation. Hunger is an enormous psychological pressure on the mind, which then leads to, as I say, these normal practices of generosity, for example, just being at least put on hold, and people become very individualized, or indeed trying to protect their small family network, if you like, rather than seeing it. So those who were seen to be struggling the most and who were most in need of food were often then deemed beyond saving, even if they weren't. And so we begin to see a kind of a middle ground moving in. It's also important, I think the final thing to note is that the famine, as I say, it's mainly a rural famine, but it also affects particular types of families in different ways. If you look, for example, at the caste system, there were particular castes, more kind of middle range castes, who were not permitted to beg. It would be beneath their caste to beg. And therefore what you find is that they are essentially dying because they cannot, the social stigma of what they do doesn't permit them to do it. And then we also see certain people in certain occupations, which I understand is still quite caste motivated as well. So for example, barbers and people who are hairdressers, because first of all, when you're starving, your hair doesn't grow as much, and also that's something that's not required, if you like. It's not an essential outgoing, and therefore workforce, as I say, barbers, people like that, dries up, and you see a disproportionate number. I talk about barbers because the literature talks about barbers, but you see a disproportionate number of barbers dying in the famine because their income evaporates. So I thought, just to finish the lecture, I would just give you a final short reading from the book. And then if any questions or want to have a chat, that would be perfectly good. Instances of famine have been avoidable since the start of organized human society, with this century witnessing a reduction in the frequency of this atrocity, despite continuing increases in the world's population. Nevertheless, the prospect of famine, a super famine indeed, remains large. If such events do unfold, then a proportion of the blame will lie with those who encourage mindless consumerism and entitlement, and a disassociation between these consumer habits and their consequence upon those mainly in the global south. As such, we have reached an unprecedented situation in terms of the public's perception of the causes of and solutions for extreme food hardship, wherein politicians and mainstream media erroneously or disingenuously attribute its occurrence to climatic phenomena, underdevelopment, cultural backwardness, the lottery of birth, an act of God, or some other disassociated catalyst, rather than it being the consequence of political decision-making that is wittingly or unwittingly inflicted on others as part of an exploitative world system. Furthermore, through charity appeals and taxation monies going to foreign aid and development assistance programs, international publics frequently consider themselves to be the solution to these hardships, rather than their consumer demands being the proxy cause. This dilution in the perception of responsibility away from governments in the post-colonial era is part of the reason why famine has not developed the same legal frameworks as other mass atrocities. In short, if there is little public or corporate appetite to prosecute, or even awareness that prosecution is appropriate, then there is little prospect of legal advance in this area. To this end, the power structures of colonialism actually provided clearer identification of where responsibility lay when famine occurred than we have today. Thus, when Bengal suffered famine during World War II, the British government did eventually acknowledge that they had some responsibility to help alleviate the situation. And this notion subtly underpins many of the communiques by British. Certainly not the case that colonial power structures are in any way preferable to the current status quo when it comes to humanitarian crises, as it was these structures that catalyzed the ravaging of India in the first place. As such, the Bengal famine of 1943 was an avoidable horror endured by rural Bengalis who lacked capital in the food hierarchy of the time. The UK's domestic wartime rationing programme was praised for its largely egalitarian division of food entitlement across demographics, but such a policy did not include Britain's colonies. Thus, to understand what occurred in rural Bengal during the 1940s, one must understand the usefulness of certain Indian communities and social groups to the means of production under colonial rule and the war effort. The British fed themselves. They fed the people of Calcutta, Chittagong, and other cities. They fed those who worked in the Indian factories that manufactured products for the war. They fed the refugees entering Assam from Burma, lest they wander into nearby military areas and spread disease. They fed the tribal regions who were in the combat zone with Japan. And they fed those Indian families with members in the military. Those who suffered the famine were those who could not afford food as a result of the boom economy and who the British did not prioritise as useful to save. This decision sits in stark contrast to domestic food policies in Britain and reveals the stark contrast between the social contracts that emerge between citizens and government under democratic and authoritarian regimes. Such a conclusion tempts us towards comparisons with Nazi Germany's treatment of the Jews and other minority groups, but this is a step too far. Despite it being largely too little too late, and despite the civic famine codes being woefully inadequate to temper the issues being experienced in wartime Bengal, the British did eventually attempt to alleviate the famine, and did so from India's central stores at the time, when victory over Japan in the Burma theatre of war was far from certain. The British diverted significant resources and manpower away from the war effort to do this. This can be seen in comparison to the Nazis, who, when they realized that those in the concentration camps were not dying quickly enough from starvation, began a program of mass murder in gas chambers from 1941. The atrocity of Bengal therefore exposes in most gruesome reality the extent to which colonialism was a system of extreme economic exploitation in which any sense of humanity for colonial subjects was prefaced by their value to the regime's priorities. Thank you.